Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now, where we bring you experts from the Badger community talking about timely and important topics. We are coming up soon on the 2-year anniversary since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we've recently passed the 4-month anniversary of the Hamas attacks on Israel, which was followed by Israel's invasion of Gaza. It's a very dangerous time, seemingly, in the world. The death and destruction of these isolated conflicts is bad enough, but it feels like they may be indicative of something larger. Some days it feels like we are truly on the cusp of World War III. With us tonight are 3 UW experts who will analyze this important moment in U.S. foreign policy. We'll try to understand what the issues are that are in play and how these conflicts may or may not be related, and how they will come into play in the 2024 election, and many other questions. Joining us tonight are 3 experts on foreign policy and international geopolitics. Jon Pevehouse is the chair of UW-Madison's Department of Political Science, and he's the Mary Herman Rubenstein Professor of Political Science and Public Policy. He's an expert on American foreign policy and has taught here for more than 20 years. In his own words on LinkedIn, he studies international relations, he knows some statistics, and he's getting old. But I reminded Jon earlier, the Bureau of Labor Statistics still considers him a prime age worker. So congratulations. Yoshiko Herrera is a professor of political science at UW-Madison with a particular interest in Russian politics and social identities. She previously taught at Harvard University before joining UW in 2007. Her research focuses on Russia, nationalism, and ethnic politics and political economy, and she teaches a course on the Russian war on Ukraine. And finally tonight, a new face for us. Stephen Brooke is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty fellow at the Association for Analytic Learning about Islam and Muslim societies, and a non-resident fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. His research and teaching focuses on comparative politics, religion and politics, non-democratic regimes, and the politics of the Middle East. Brooke joined the faculty at UW-Madison in the summer of 2019 after 3 years on the faculty at the University of Louisville, earned his PhD at the University of Texas. So Stephen, Yoshiko, Jon, thank you all for joining us this evening, taking time out of your busy schedules. I know you're in high demand on these topics and others, and we really thank you for spending some time with UW alumni and friends tonight.
Thanks for having
us off.
Thank you.
Will be Jon. He's going to give us an overview of these conflicts across the globe and their possible interdependence and some of the challenges and dangers that might lie ahead. So without further adu, Jon Pevehouse.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that introduction. It's good to know that at least according to the BLS, I've still got it. Mike, you kicked us off by saying, this feels like a very unstable time. And I have to agree. I was thinking back and, the 1950s were a time, I think, of similar instability, especially in the Middle East, especially in Europe. 1953, you had a coup in Iran that almost upended the region with the help of the United States. You had in 1956 simultaneous crises in Suez and in Hungary, sort of mirroring what we have going on in Ukraine and the Middle East now. You had a coup in Syria in 54, and one had happened a couple of years before as well. And in 58, you had a really significant coup in Iraq, which kind of upended the alliance system in the Middle East that the British and the Americans had built in the post-World War II era. And so this was a time in which you had sort of a lot of uncertainty about the world and what was going on. And I think we see very similar parallels here. The difference being there's even more uncertainty now, because at least what you could say in 1956 and 53, ironically, was the Cold War was going on. We kind of knew everyone's side. And I think many people, scholars have argued over the years that we were sort of too ready to put all of these regional and area conflicts into that container, Cold War container. But at least that gave the world some structure, right? We don't have that now. As I'll talk about briefly, we have kind of an emerging China which is increasingly playing a role. We have Russia, which Professor Herrera will talk a lot more about. And we have an emergent Iran in the Middle East, which I know Professor Brooke knows a lot about. But, if you hearken back to, a year and a half ago in the United States, thinking about the Middle East in particular, all the discussion in Washington, in a way, was like, oh my gosh, we can finally sort of rid ourselves of this region. Right now, no one was really thinking that in 100%, but that was a discussion that was being had in circles in Washington. Like, is it finally time to put the Middle East down? And the Biden administration wanted nothing more than to be able to do that. President after president, Republican after Democrat, had sort of failed to bring peace to the Middle East. They'd failed to bring sort of an overarching stability pact to the region. And so the hope was, well, if things just stay quiet, we can move on. And there's lots of reasons. There were reasons in January 2023 to think that might have been the case. There was a growing rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, which came along during the Trump administration, linking the Gulf monarchies and Morocco to Israel. There was, increasingly ironically, kind of a domestic meltdown in Israel, which made Israel seem politically in the United States like not the, best partner moving forward with the controversy over the Netanyahu government and the judicial reforms. There's an increasing push for decarbonization in the region, which meant we would be increasingly less reliant over time, over future generations, on oil from the region. So you put all these things together, and the failed Arab Spring as well, I should say, right? So this idea, whether it was Obama's idea or the Bush administration's idea, the W administration's idea of sort of democratization by diplomacy or democratization by force, all had kind of been thrown out the window. And then two things happened in 2023 that obviously kind of get the United States reignited towards at least this part of the world. The first was in March of 2023, when the Saudis and the Iranians announced that they'd reached kind of a framework deal on an agreement with the help of China. So all of a sudden, China looms large in a region where they had mostly, stayed very far away, other than buying oil. You also then, of course, in October had, as you said, the Hamas attacks on Israel. And between these two events, over about a 6-month period, now Washington is no longer talking about getting rid of the Middle East. Rather, what we were getting is discussions of the Biden doctrine, which is the idea that we can negotiate a comprehensive settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We can bring rapprochement between Israel and its neighbors. We can sort of reevaluate Turkey in its role in the region as a NATO ally, and then we can essentially contain Iran, who we view, as sort of part of not the axis of resistance, but formerly the axis of evil. And there's domestic reasons for this, right? In the United States, obviously, the politics of the Ukraine conflict, the politics of the Israeli-Gaza war have divided somewhat both parties in the United States, with lots of voices entering the fray on that and creating some electoral instability. Again, the rising role of China, right? And will China become a growing actor in this region? Will they sort of supplant the United States as a regional diplomatic leader? Will China's role with Russia, relationship with Russia, give them some kind of a benefit or some kind of leverage in the Ukraine war? And as well, I think you have sort of the continued sort of instability within Israeli politics. Again, this conflict has sort of galvanized support for Netanyahu in the short run, but in the long run, once the conflict is over, it's hard to know what direction that's going to go. And then put, of course, on top of this, about almost a month ago at this point, well, 3.5 weeks ago at this point, the attack on American soldiers on the Syria-Jordanian border, and growing strikes by Iran in the region. So as you say, Mike, there's kind of a growing sense of this instability. We don't have this sort of overarching framework of the Cold War anymore. So where does this go? I'm anxious to hear questions from the audience members on this, but I think ultimately, right now the U.S. is struggling a little bit on the foreign policy side. You have political parties, both the Republicans and the Democratic Party, are divided on some of these core issues and how active the U.S. should be. What is the U.S. role in the world? The Iraq War soured a huge segment of the American population on intervening strongly in the Middle East. Public opinion polls consistently show that Americans favor some kind of peace agreement in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Yet diplomatically making that happen is difficult. We've just seen in the news today, and I know Professor Herrera will talk about this, the increasing or the Senate deal to provide aid to Ukraine, but that again, that's growing controversy in the US. And so you've got a lot of uncertainty. And I think as a scholar of international relations, one thing that we always look for is not even so much the presence of conflict, the presence of peace, but the presence of that uncertainty, and kind of not knowing exactly actors' intentions, not knowing exactly what policies are going to be effective in changing those actors' intentions, or at least containing those actors' intentions. So we're living in a brave new world. About a year and a half ago, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken started beginning a lot of his talks and press conferences by saying the post-Cold War world is over. Right? We have entered a new era of geopolitical competition. And we see that playing out on a daily basis in the Middle East. We see that playing out in Europe. We may increasingly see that playing out in other parts of the world as well, whether it's Southeast Asia or Latin America. So it's a time of high uncertainty. It's a time where there's a lot of folks casting about in the US, I think, about what is the right way forward, what is the US role. And so I look forward to talking about these issues over the next hour. Thanks.
Setting the stage for us, and now we'd like to turn our attention more specifically to the war between Russia and Ukraine. And Yoshiko Herrera has joined us several times on this topic in the past, and indeed almost exactly 2 years ago you laid out your thoughts about how this would unfold, and I have to say you were very, very prescient in certainly how things unfolded over the first year. Obviously, circumstances seem to be changing a bit now, and it looks like a long, drawn-out affair potentially. But please, Yoshiko, tell us more about what you're hearing and what you're thinking about the situation in Ukraine and related issues.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yes, I wanted to talk today a little bit about Ukraine in the global context rather than just how the war is going. And I guess I want to start with my final point, which is that I think it's important for people to understand that a victory for Ukraine is a victory for the United States and the West. Just want to make sure the slides are moving. I think, okay, yeah, perfect. Okay, yeah. Because I think the converse is also true, that if Russia wins in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin and his allies in dictatorships in Iran, North Korea, China will be emboldened to fight the West on other fronts. I think that not just the territory, nation, statehood of Ukraine is at stake, but actually the global rules-based order, I think, is what we're looking at here. So I think that we have to understand this conflict in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine per se, but as about a larger context of the West and democracies versus dictatorship. Next slide. This is a sort of update of what's happening in Ukraine. The slide on the left is where the war was approximately a month into it on March 31st, 2022. Ukraine made various, had some successes pushing the Russians back. And by this time last year, that's the middle slide, February 12th, 2023, Ukraine had secured Kiev. They had pushed the Russians back to the east. But if you compare last year, February 12th, with this year, February 12th, just yesterday, you can see that the front line has hardly moved at all. So whereas the initial month of the war saw a lot of Russian advances, and 2022 saw some significant gains for Ukraine in pushing the Russians back, there has been not much change in the last year plus in how the war is going. And there's many commentators talking about why that is, what the problem is, but most people agree that at this point, what's really needed for Ukraine, for a victory for Ukraine, is more ammunition, more supplies, and principally supplies, military supplies from the West and from the United States. Ukraine is facing an ammunition as well as shortage in manpower, and Russia has reformed its economy to some extent, transitioned its economy to much more of a war footing, and they are willing to fight it out. So you could say it's a war of attrition at this point. I think that's a fair characterization. But it is still a very active war. A lot of people continue to die. And so it continues to be very active, if not moving in terms of territorial control. Next slide. One of the things that happened in Ukraine just in the last week is that President Zelensky replaced the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Valery Zaluzhny, with General Alexander Syrsky. This is a really important change in leadership because Zaluzhny is very popular, but there had been tension between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. There's a lot of discussion of whether it was a good move or not. But one of the things I think it does show very clearly and importantly is the issue of civilian control over the military, which is important in a democracy, regardless of how the war is going. Another important development over the last week, next slide, was Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. Now, there's a lot of reasons to critique this interview. It was very long and boring, for one thing. If anybody watched it, it's 2 hours long. It starts out with over a half an hour of deep history monologue by Putin. But what did we learn from this interview? And I think there were a couple of key points that people might think about. One is that the politics of memory or history, the politicized history, is very important to Vladimir Putin. This is not just a side thing. This is something he's brought up repeatedly. He brought it up on February 21st and on February 24th in his televised speeches announcing the war. And so I think we have to understand that the idea of this imperial reach and imperial vision for Putin is very important. In addition, despite Tucker Carlson asking Putin repeatedly to confirm that it was the threat of NATO that caused the invasion, Putin ignored those questions and just went on and on about Russian lands and Russian Empire. So I think something to take away from this is that Putin is not listening. He literally was not listening to Tucker Carlson. He doesn't update based on new information, and he gave zero indication that he is planning to stop the war at any time soon. Next slide, and this is my final slide. I wish that there were some easy answers for how to end the war, what to do. But I want to just instead lay out, I think, some of the challenges. Number one, Ukraine cannot win the war without external military support. That is very clear. And while there is a commitment from the US and from European allies to support Ukraine, as we know from watching the US Congress, US domestic politics is really complicating the foreign policy goals of the United States. So there may be a commitment rhetorically, and maybe people feel a commitment to help Ukraine win, to defeat Russia. But the military aid for Ukraine has been tied up, and military aid for Israel, as well as humanitarian aid, has been tied up with other domestic considerations, including securing the border, and not just principles of border security or things like that, but also the politics of who looks like they win if something is passed. And so the domestic political context in the US is very complicated and somewhat separate from ideal visions or principles that people may have. So there are different views people may have, but none of those views are necessarily the reason why bills are being passed or not passed, because there's other domestic considerations that are coming in. Something I think people have to understand, however, is that Ukraine is going to keep fighting whether it gets support or not, but these delays cost lives. So I think the idea that if you don't support Ukraine, if you hold up this aid to Ukraine, that they will get the message and stop fighting, that is not going to happen. They're going to continue to fight for their nationhood and their state. And at the same time, Russia is going to continue to fight until it's defeated militarily. It would like a defeat of Ukraine and the West, and it's going to keep working towards that goal. And finally, final point, and these are things that have already been touched on by Jon. There's a lot of conflicts in the world, but at this point, the U.S. reputation and the reliability of the United States is really being questioned around the world. Because when people look to the U.S. and they see that we may say we're going to do one thing, but when it comes to congressional action, we do something different, or when you have a great divergence in presidential candidates or political parties on where America stands on very basic issues like support for NATO or support of allies, it reasonably brings up questions about where the United States is going and whether the United States can be counted on. And I'll leave it there, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Professor Herrera. Great perspective on these issues as usual. And now I'd like to turn to a new guest on our program, Associate Professor Stephen Brooke, once again, Director of UW's Middle East Studies program. And he understands many facets of life in that region and how it might impact some of the alliances and the situation that we're facing today geopolitically. So, Professor Brooke, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Mike Knetter and to his whole team for setting this up. And I kind of wish we could figure out a way for political scientists to be able to talk about kind of joyful and optimistic things. But nonetheless, I'm really happy to be here with you all, and I look forward to hearing from you and your questions. And just to kind of give a little bit of a quick rundown and just kind of jump around the region, the Middle East, and kind of talk through some of the developments that have been occurring following October 7th. But just so as kind of you guys know, many of you know, October 7th was a really kind of dramatic shock to the system in a lot of ways. And if you just think about it from the numbers perspective, for example, is around 1,100 Israelis were killed, 700 of whom were civilians, 240 of them were taken hostage. And this was kind of a moment where the Israeli kind of security guarantee or kind of the Israeli security blanket was punctured in a way that it had never been before, right? Even in moments in, for instance, 1973, you never had the loss of civilian life at this scale, and you never had the kind of military defeat, units being overrun to the extent that they were on October 7th. And I think that is kind of the shock, and the scale of that is, I think, really kind of telling to understand some of the kind of Israeli response to this. And so just to kind of on the Israeli side, as of now, some number of hostages have been killed. It's kind of not exactly clear what the numbers are, and a small handful of hostages have been rescued. But as you all also know, Israel launched a kind of devastating attack on the Gaza Strip soon after the October 7th attack. We have now kind of 30,000 confirmed dead. The majority of those are women and children. And there's countless wounded. And now we have kind of this new specter of famine and disease that is a real problem. And just to take a kind of one step back, whatever you kind of think about the motives, about who is right and who is wrong, and so on and so forth, I think it's important to just recognize first and foremost that this is really a kind of a true humanitarian catastrophe of the highest order, and it really is a tragedy. And I think the scope of this death and destruction, this puts into kind of relief the risks of the escalation, because we don't really have moments where there was kind of a precedent for this type of escalation. And I think Professor Pevehouse had a really nice kind of way of summarizing the U.S. attitude towards the region before October 7th. And one of the things that I would just point to is the kind of U.S. National Security Advisor, someone named Jake Sullivan. He wrote in the pages of Foreign Affairs, which is kind of one of the top magazines in kind of establishment Washington foreign policy, literally a few days before October 7th, that, quote, "The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades." So safe to say this really kind of caught many, many people off guard. And I think to some extent, the main risk, we can think of it as kind of just packaged under this ongoing conflict or tension between the U.S. and Iran, right? And the U.S. and Iran have been at loggerheads kind of on and off since 1979. I think one of the things to keep in mind here is that both the U.S. and Iran kind of don't want to let this escalate. But there are reasons to believe that it may actually get out of hand just simply because of the sheer proliferation of conflicts that are currently underway in the region. And I think we can think, for instance, of Lebanon. So if you want to put the map up, we could just kind of walk through what it kind of just around Israel and Palestine and the region. And so in Lebanon, kind of one of the early responses internationally to the fighting was some attacks across the Lebanese border. Israel assassinated a Hamas commander in Beirut, in kind of southern Beirut. And the major, I think, risk from the Israeli perspective is that Hezbollah, the kind of military political organization in Lebanon, might actually kind of come to and open up a second front. I think that's a kind of a really, really dangerous scenario. We can kind of go east a little bit and think about Syria and Jordan. I think Jon, mentioned that an American base on the Syrian-Jordanian border was attacked, and a drone attack leading to kind of the deaths of 3 American troops. And I think these kind of smaller attacks have been kind of a feature of the region since October 7th, and kind of drone attacks and mortar attacks and various attacks on U.S. bases, and to some extent on U.S. embassies. You see this in Iraq too, right? Where this cycle has really kicked up, and it's potentially kind of led to kind of the Iraqi prime minister making noises about requesting the formal withdrawal of American troops from the region. It's kind of unclear the extent to which this is kind of realistic, but it's something that's been put on the table. And if we kind of shift down south and kind of look at Yemen, right, and kind of the bottom corner there of the Arabian Peninsula, as many of you know, one of the ways that a group in Yemen has responded to the October 7th attacks and kind of the Israeli counterattacks was to launch attacks on Red Sea shipping. And so if you just look at the map there and think about ships coming from the east, right, through the Indian Ocean, up through the Red Sea, coming through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, that's a pretty major kind of shipping corridor, right? And variously, 25% of kind of container ship traffic is going through that particular narrow area. And so when in Yemen, this armed group, the Houthi rebels, start to attack container ships and threaten container ships, that has a major effect on just kind of the global kind of economic system, right? Ships are rerouting around Southern Africa to kind of avoid the risk of potentially being targeted while passing through that region. And so I think kind of those are kind of the major hotspots where we see potentially armed conflict breaking out in various forms. But I think looking at kind of Egypt is instructive about maybe some of the lower profile ways that this conflict actually makes major risks to stability in the region. You could just imagine being kind of an Egyptian military planner, right? And you wake up in the morning and you kind of try to think about what the threats facing the country are. And you kind of look south and you see that there's Sudan, and there's actually a civil war in Sudan. And then you kind of look to your west and you see Libya there, and you realize that for 5 years there was a civil war there with intense fighting along the border, and now it's held together by a peace, and then a very fragile peace. Then you kind of look to your east into the Sinai Peninsula, and you know that there's kind of an ongoing insurgency by a franchise affiliate of kind of the Islamic State. And Egypt has been fighting that for years, really. And so when they see this conflict breaking out in Palestine, this to Egyptian officials is a really kind of just a major threat. I mean, what are you going to do if you're an Egyptian official and you just look literally right across the border into the Gaza Strip, into the Rafah, through the Rafah crossing into Rafah, this area in the southern Gaza Strip, to which all of these people have been pushed, and now Israel is threatening a ground invasion. This is a serious thing. And so when you kind of imagine the way that Egyptian officials are viewing this, you can kind of get a sense of like how seriously they feel this insecurity and this sense of crisis in the region. They talk about potentially suspending Camp David, right? The peace agreement, which is kind of the cornerstone of U.S. security in the region. You also see, every time a ship goes through the Suez Canal, that's a source of really hard currency for Egypt, right? Foreign currency that it really, really needs to buck up its economy. And now that those ships are all rerouting, and that's just another hit that they're taking. So this is affecting kind of small countries that are not directly engaged in the fighting, but really in a severe way. And I think just to kind of close, I would say there are some really kind of troubling signs that I see when I look at the region, kind of even beyond kind of some of the stuff that I've laid out. I think one is there's really just a difficulty in understanding what exactly does success look like for the Israelis, right? Like, what are the goals that they want to accomplish with this attack on Gaza? And even from the U.S. perspective, if you could kind of understand what that end game looks like, you could take steps to bring it forward, right? And you have the U.S. as kind of engaged in more in the hostage negotiation, that side of it. But on the bigger picture stuff, there's just really very little attempts from the Biden administration, I think, to kind of de-escalate. And so you see this, refusing to push for a ceasefire, refusing to try and meaningfully reduce civilian casualties or protect Palestinian civilians. And I think this kind of ties into this question about the political implications here. Is you even have American kind of officials claiming that there's no regional escalation, there's no broader conflict. And I think part of this is just, Biden understands he doesn't want to go into November and the election with a war that has broken out, and that would not be a good thing for him politically. But I think it also kind of maybe speaks a little bit to the fact that kind of American officials are kind of hoping that this thing doesn't escalate, but maybe are reluctant to take some kind of large steps to actually prevent that from happening. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. We can bring back all of our guests now. Really appreciate your comments kicking us off, each of you. I'm going to start with some audience questions that we've had come in on the Russian economy, and I'll start with you, Jon. One of the early acts after the invasion was to try to, I guess, cut off the Russian economy from most of global commerce, at least the extent to which they were interacting with the West. How's the Russian economy doing, and what's your assessment of how well those sanctions worked?
Sure. I would definitely defer to Professor Herrera on this one, but I will say from the big early concerns, especially along the petrochemicals or oil, kind of fossil fuels idea, was that, as Germany, as they shut off Nord Stream and stopped Nord Stream 2, that this sort of the West would not be able to maintain that, right? I mean, that was sort of the first uncertainty, was like, could we actually cut ourselves off? Could Western Europe in particular, Central Europe, cut itself off from Russian supplies? And they largely have. And, I think for a variety of things that were good policy and also some good luck, fairly mild winter the last couple of years, that, they've been able to kind of maintain that. Russia's obviously found other sources to buy some of their, supplies, places like China. But I think, as Joey said, they've kind of reconfigured that economy they reconfigured the Russian economy to a large extent, and been able to kind of roll with this in a way that I will say, and again, I'm no expert on this, but that was a little surprising to me, given how sort of plodding, or at least the reputation of the Russian economy to be rather plodding is. And so, but again, I would kind of defer to Joey on this one.
Yeah, I would just add that on the one hand, Russia has been, the sanctions have been successful in weakening Russia long term. There's really no question of that. That long-term economic prognosis for Russia is terrible. But in the short term, they have been able to still sell oil to certain countries like India, China. And actually, India processes some of that oil and then resells it back to Europe. And so there are ways in which the sanctions and the price caps on oil have worked, but in other ways, Russia is able to evade some of those things. Some of the really important things are technology, microchips, and things like that. And there's now a lot of evidence that while a lot of countries are formally participating in the sanctions, there's also some leakiness. And that is an area where the U.S. and the West and the countries that are in favor of the sanctions could be doing more. But just the final thing I'll say is that Russia is actively hiding information it used to share about its economy. And so it's going to project the idea that it doesn't have inflation, that its GDP is growing and things like that. And we know very clearly that they're overstating their success in dealing with the sanctions.
Yoey, I just want to stick with that topic for a minute. Russia's economy is about the size of Canada. I think, from a GDP standpoint, about 1/10 the size of the United States. And people seem, stressed about our ability to arm Ukraine. How does Russia sustain this? Are they just better, as a share of their economy at allocating effort toward ammunition and weaponry and the manpower needed?
Well, it's a non-democratic country with a regime that stays in power through the use of violence. So they're directing resources towards the military, to some extent towards military families, families who have lost loved ones. But if people are unhappy, there's not much they can do about it. If their jobs have dried up because of sanctions, if they cannot buy new eyeglasses or phones, or they can't watch movies on Netflix, there's not much they can do about it. They just have to sit there and take it. And if Russia is now building tanks and shells and things like that and not investing in consumer goods, I mean, it's kind of a repeat of the Soviet Union. Russia is basically the only investor in its own economy. I mean, it's a autarkic, war-oriented economy. So everybody is probably hoping that, consumers in Russia are hoping that the war ends soon and things could get back to normal. But the government doesn't really care about this lack of consumer satisfaction and things like that. So in a democratic context, you wouldn't be able to just orient the economy towards one policy goal and have everybody just live with it.
And what is your sense of the impact of this conflict on the U.S. weapons stockpile? Is it significant? Or have we been able to ramp up our own production and we're kind of status quo?
Well, Jon might say a little bit more about that, but I would say, a lot of the aid that we're giving to Ukraine is actually contracts with our own defense industries in order to build things that we then send over to Ukraine. So it's on the plus side, a lot of that aid is actually good for the U.S. economy. I have faith in our military planners and Defense Department to not put us in a situation that we cannot defend ourselves, just to help Ukraine. And Ukraine is getting certain things like shells from South Korea and different places. But there has been a consistent, unfortunate pattern of delay, kind of waffling, and then decision like, okay, then we'll send this. And eventually things do get sent, but these delays are unfortunately costly. Although I do think a lot of the aid has a certain benefit in the United States, especially if it's going through our defense industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, most U.S. aid on most issues is what we would call tied aid. It's not like we're sending checks over, briefcases full of cash. It is credits. It's merchandise or good credits, which then get sent back here. One thing I would quickly point out to kind of tie Ukraine and Israel together, this week there was a lot of news coming out of Washington about Senate and House Democrats in particular trying to introduce a new bill that would limit the use of certain types of military equipment sales, generally, broadly speaking, to try to limit their goals, to try to limit rearmament of Israel and the Israeli military. But of course, the flip side is you've got to try to draw up a law that's going to, many of them want that to apply to Israel, but not Ukraine. And so, this is something that's never been really discussed a lot before in Congress, or that's gotten much support in Congress. But that's sort of part of the duality of this circumstance. There's a constituency that says if you're going to give lethal aid to a side, you have to check a certain number of boxes or see how they're using that aid. But of course, we hope both sides, everyone is using it in a way that respects human rights. But if there's a suspicion that it's not, then that aid gets limited by this, that would be limited by this law. And so this sort of shows the uncertainty in this, the fact that you've got so many simultaneous conflicts going on. It's sort of hard to balance all of these different views in the foreign policy realm.
So there's been more use of drone technology, I guess, especially in the attacks on the shipping in the Middle East, but also in the Ukraine conflict as well. Who do you think controls the edge in technology, and have we used as much conventional technology as we might in some of these back and forth volleys that we've seen?
I think drone technology is absolutely critical in the Ukraine war. And I think I think there's little question that it's going to continue to be important in coming conflicts for a number of reasons. One, it's relatively cheap, and two, it's pretty effective. Different countries, including Ukraine, are really putting a lot of effort into trying to build up their drone capabilities in terms of production, and also the capabilities of the drones. Right now, Russia is getting a lot of its drones from Iran. I guess that's another connection of Iranian drones in other parts of the world. So I think this is a kind of interesting thing of, on the one hand, you have this fortified front line in Ukraine, which is a reminiscent of World War I trench warfare. But at the same time, it's combined with drones. So it's not just World War I era technology. There's certain aspects of it that are really difficult, like these fortified lines. But another difficult part is that when different sides try to break out, they're easily seen by drones. So the drones are very important as the front line is developing, and I think they're just going to continue to be important.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say one of the things that we see throughout the Middle East and through the proliferation of just incredibly cheap drone technology is that this just becomes a very kind of low cost and fairly effective way to attack military forces, particularly when it's the weaker side that's doing it, right? And you kind of see it being integrated, as you mentioned, in the Houthi attacks on shipping. In fact, in January, there were 2 U.S. Navy SEALs that died on an interdiction mission to particularly try and intercept Iranian drone technology that was headed to Yemen, right? And in this recent attack on the American base in Jordan, Syria, Outpost 22, that was done by an Iranian drone. And just the nature of this, the cheapness and the precision of being able to use this drone technology, it effectively makes it very hard for countermeasures to be fully effective, right? And I think it's one of these areas where the innovation is in the offensive technology and offensive use of these drones, and the defensive technology is always going to lag behind that a step, even when it's a case like the United States, which has kind of a clear technological edge and a capacity to think up all of these interesting ways to potentially protect from drones.
I would just add one quick thing here. The strikes by Iran in Pakistan, in Syria, and in Iraq, which got a lot of attention a couple of weeks ago, which then, Pakistan then responded against Iran. Those were drone strikes. And if you think about that for a minute, Iran has a lot of security assets in Syria and Iraq. They could have easily sent a number of forces to take out these, what they claimed were small camps of anti-Iranian forces, but they didn't. They used drones. And, they were able to do so quickly. They were able to do so very quietly. And so it's just providing a whole set of tools that, even if you have the kind of more of the traditional military equipment, it's kind of what Yoey was saying. If you have that traditional military lines, they're still useful for a variety of things. And as Stephen said, countermeasures are difficult. And the technology is quickly moving. So, we're going to keep seeing more of this. And I think there's going to be a real emphasis in the U.S. about countermeasures now, because now that this the genie is out of the bottle at this point, and, we're not going back.
About these two conflicts, and maybe I'll start with Yoey and then go to Stephen. Would anything short of total control of Ukraine be acceptable to Putin? And would anything short of total eradication of Hamas be acceptable to the Netanyahu government?
Yeah, I think that Putin overall wants political and military control over Ukraine. But he's probably willing to accept some kind of very weakened Ukrainian regime control of, the territory that he currently is controlling now, in order to give time for Russia to rebuild and start the next war. So acceptable, yes, because they would love a pause to be able to rebuild and figure out other plans. But this would be a major, any sort of pause in the fighting where Putin gets legitimate control over the territory that Russia is currently occupying in Ukraine. They would consider a major win. And again, the big threat for other countries is that it would embolden Putin further. I don't think there's any question, and you can see by his statements, that he doesn't have an idea that there's a certain border that he's willing to stop at, or there's a certain one thing that he wants. He wants control, not just of Ukraine, but over this whole historic Russian area. I mean, it's quite concerning how much he spoke about Poland, frankly, in the interview with Tucker Carlson. So I think that acceptable, yes, he would like everybody to stop arming Ukraine and for Ukraine to stop fighting so that they could regroup and go further.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of one of the big questions that looms over this is, what are the Israeli goals, right? The reason that all of this fighting is occurring and the conditions under which they'll stop. And, Netanyahu has been very vocal that the point of this is to destroy Hamas. And, this has been kind of a sticking point in recent negotiations to try and return the hostages, and why those negotiations haven't really gone anywhere is because Netanyahu is unwilling to agree to anything that leaves Hamas in power, right? And actually, he's come under a lot of fire from the families of the hostages. I think that the difficult thing is that there are just so many different factions inside Israeli politics and society, and they all have kind of different goals in this, right? And I think you have the one goal, it's about fighting and returning the hostages, getting the hostages back. You have another it's about destroying Hamas. You have another where it's about reestablishing some level of deterrence against future attacks that might take place. You have the whole domestic politics angle, which is they're going to fight to preserve Netanyahu's political future, right? And the instant that the fighting stops, there's a political reckoning for him. And there's also a segment of the Israeli government and the kind of political coalition that wants to ethnically cleanse and resettle Gaza, right? And I think the way that these goals are in tension with each other and kind of constantly shifting around makes it kind of hard to kind of think about a potential end to this conflict. It's just a very difficult one to try and manage, particularly for somebody like the United States that's trying to kind of think about it on the outside.
What are the chances that, I guess, the stress that the United States is under on multiple fronts right now makes it tempting for the Chinese government to become a little bit more adventurous?
Yeah, I've thought about this one quite a bit. I mean, on one hand, yes, that certainly is a possibility. Although, if you, and this is one of these things where if you read, you pick up 3 different, think tank papers out of Washington about this question, you get 3 completely different answers, right? One view is, and it's a general view of China, that we've seen peak China, right? China is falling. This is sort of the Krugman view, like China's hit its peak, it's on the way down. They can talk a big game, but ultimately, they're, like I say, on the way down. Another is that, oh no, China's still a rising power. We haven't seen the best of them yet. They're still definitely going to expand. And the other, which is where I tend to come down, is like ultimately China is driven by economic interests. These are not ideological interests. This is not a religious interest. This is trying to expand the economy and keep the PLA in power by keeping their economy buzzing as long and as hard as it can. And that's ultimately what all of these political interventions in the Middle East come down to, is trying to provide stability so they can buy oil, open up markets, continue the investment through Central Asia and into Africa. And, I think it's very narrowly tailored. I mean, the example I gave of them working on Iran and Saudi relations, like that took a lot of people in Washington by surprise. People were disappointed. There was a lot of hand wringing. But then you kind of take a step back. The vast majority of that diplomatic work was done by Oman. And sort of China wrote in the last week of the negotiations, wrote some checks, and then, signed the deal. That's just kind of the Chinese model at this point. And I don't see that changing. They don't want to touch the politics of the region with a 10-foot pole. Unless it somehow gets in the way of their economic interests there. So that's just kind of my take.
Well,
I would like that to be true, but I don't know. I'm a little bit more worried, I guess I would say. I think China took the initial message from the beginning in 2022 that it's not a good time to invade Taiwan because look at what an incredibly quick and unified front the United States and Europe took against Russia, and look at the economic cost to Russia. And so I think that the initial Western response to Ukraine, I think, would have been deterring to China because they would have felt the economic impact of sanctions even more in some ways than Russia because of its globalized economy. But the uncertainty over the Middle East, the internal strife in what to do about Gaza, and the current questions about U.S. support, not only for Ukraine, but for NATO, I think have to bring up a lot of questions for other actors around the world, including China, much more uncertainty, just like you were saying earlier, John, about we don't really know what the response would be. What exactly would the response be if China were to invade Taiwan? I think that we're much less certain today than we were even a few months ago.
Well, I think we should wrap things up, but how about we attempt, I'm going to channel Stephen Brooke, we attempt to leave our listeners with some words of optimism. What are the biggest reasons to be hopeful that things could actually get better in the near term? And I don't know, Stephen, do you want to take a shot first, and then we'll go to Yoey and then John to wrap us up?
I mean, I think a glib answer would be, I don't know that things can get worse. So, even a dead cat bounces. But, I do think that one thing that has happened with recent events is just to kind of put it very clearly that the current American approach to the region, it doesn't work, right? And I don't think it gets any closer to solving problems. I think it maybe potentially damps down violence at some points and allows it to kind of spin up at others. But I just think that it underscores the need for maybe a bunch of reasons, frankly, to really kind of rethink what the U.S.'s approach to the region has been. And I don't know what the proper policy is, but I do think that it's a pretty clear condemnation that it hasn't worked so far.
Yeah, I think, okay, I was rather depressed last week. I'm a little bit more optimistic this week, but I think one thing to think about is actually we do have the capacity in the United States to solve a lot of problems. We have the capacity to solve problems in our state, in Wisconsin, in Washington, and we have the capacity to do a lot of good in the world. So we're not in a situation where there's nothing we can do. It's hopeless. We actually can do things. So I think one way to think about it is like, come on, let's solve some of these problems and work together to do so.
Yeah, I guess I would just kind of riff off that a little bit. If you look, especially in the Middle East, of the area I maybe know the best, maybe not saying much given my advanced age, but, out of every major peace agreement, every major breakthrough has come after a crisis. Right. And kind of similar to what Stephen and Yoey wrote saying, it's like you have these moments, these kind of flashpoint moments where things are pretty bad and people sort of take a step back and they reassess and they look. And that doesn't mean the solution's any easier or that the views are any less entrenched on any of these sides. But, I take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if you would have asked, I happened to be in Israel about a month before October 7th. And, if you would ask anyone in Israel, like, what's where on the list of 15 things is this conflict? It would have been 15th. If you'd ask what's the 20th, they'd have said 20th. And, it's forcing Israelis, I think, to rethink the situation. I think it's forcing Palestinians to rethink the situation in the US, as Stephen said. And so maybe out of that comes some initiative. Maybe it is the Biden doctrine. Maybe it's some other doctrine or some other idea. We'll see. But, hopefully out of crisis comes some positive opportunity.
I think those are great words. Sometimes when people appreciate how costly the status quo has become, it forces harder thinking and, maybe creates the possibility for our own political system to pull together a little bit and find some common ground and some solutions, because it certainly does look like a dangerous place out there. And we can't afford to be playing internal politics quite as much. So anyway, I thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday night again to join us. Very thoughtful comments, and let's hope these optimistic words at the end prevail and we find a way forward. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thanks to our audience again. Great questions. I was not referencing everyone, but I certainly appreciate Mike Serlith and Bob Graham, Mike Benninger, Tammy Olson, William Schmitz chiming in with some great questions tonight. There were others that we didn't get to, but really appreciate you joining us. And we'll be back again next month with another episode of the UW Now on Tuesday, March 12th, topic to be determined. Thank you, and on Wisconsin.
In 1848, just 2 months after the creation of our beloved state, a great university was born, the University of Wisconsin, to serve, educate, and benefit people from every corner of Wisconsin and beyond. And for 175 years, we have pushed forward, energizing dreams and igniting innovation. With educational opportunities that create promise and research that improves lives, UW-Madison is a place where an idea can change the world. And as we look forward, we also look back to stand up for what's right, build common bonds, and a better future. When combined with inspired goofiness and Badger spirit, there's an inspirational and unconventional vibe that's all Madison. It's more than just fun and games, though. At the UW, we go from brainstorms to breakthroughs, from today's students to tomorrow's leaders. This is where an idea can change the world, the whole world, a corner of the world, my world, our world. UW-Madison's profound eurekas and personal ahas transform us all and serve the greater good. As proud Badgers, we celebrate the last 175 years and the next as the UW charges forward. On Wisconsin.